All right, we're back for the Will of God Part 2. I realize that often I don't look super presentable, but I guess this is real life for me. You're getting a chance to look into my life as I'm working out in the yard, as I'm doing something. Suddenly an inspiration will come. I'll go do a bit of a Bible study, and then this is what you get. So I hope you didn't tune in to see a good hairdo, that's for sure. So the next few set of verses I would like to look at with you are found in Peter, and they are a topic in and of themselves, and I think it deserves a lot of attention in our day and age, and in any day and age, I would imagine. But it's this: the will of God. What is the will of God? Many people in today's world would say the will of God is that God loves you so much, He wants you to have a great life, He wants you to prosper and do well, and that's part of it. Sometimes He does want us to prosper. Sometimes He does want us to have a great life. Other times He allows things to happen to us that He wants us to rejoice in, even though. He wants us to, in spite of the circumstances, in spite of the tyranny around us, in spite of all things going wrong in the world that we live in, He wants us to rejoice anyhow. And that's what First Peter really is all about. Let's look at a couple verses here where the term will of God is used. This is clear and express. I mean, it's the express will of God for our lives. And it could not be any clearer than these verses, and they're not that exciting. Chapter 2, verse 15, 1 Peter 2:15. For so is the will of God. What is the will of God? How is the will of God? How do I accomplish the will of God? For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. So foolish men will come after you. People will despise you and hate you. They will not appreciate your gospel. They will not appreciate the life that you live. And they will come after you, and they will hate you for what you believe. That's what First Peter is all about. They were being persecuted. They were being hated. They were being used and abused, and it was not fun for those folks. And yet he says, it is the will of God that with well-doing you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Governors, people that are sent to punish evildoers and so on. He says, you are free, but don't use your freedom as a cloak of maliciousness. And then in the next chapter, chapter 3, verse 17, he says this: for it is better, if the will of God be so, that ye suffer for well-doing than for evil-doing. So if you're going to suffer, if there's going to be difficulty in your life, may it be brought on to you by doing the right thing, not by doing the wrong thing. Some people will go and really make a mess of their life, and they'll do horrible things, and they'll create a bunch of bad circumstances, and then they'll cry out as if they're being persecuted and say, oh, I'm just suffering for God's will. That's not what he's talking about here. He's saying you did the right thing. You're loving God supremely. You're no longer running after idolatry. You're no longer worshiping idols. You're no longer running to the same excess of riot, as he says. You're not partying and drinking and whatever else anymore. Now you're talking about Jesus, and you're suffering for it. He says, it is good, if the will of God be so, that ye suffer for well-doing and not evil-doing. Then in chapter 4, we get into the main part that I'd like to really talk about. He says this in chapter 4, verse 2, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lusts of men, but to the will of God. So speaking of, excuse me, speaking of Jesus, how he suffered in the flesh, he says, I want you to arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. Jesus came to this world armed with this idea: I'm going to suffer. I'm going to go to the cross. I'm going to lay down my life. He says, arm yourself with that same mind. Go into life knowing people are going to take advantage of me. Things will not go well. It might be someone else's fault, but I will take the blame. It can be very simple things. Something happens at work. Somebody makes a dumb mistake. When the boss comes around, instead of ratting him out, saying, this guy did something stupid, you could say, we didn't do something correct. Something went wrong, and we made a mistake. Now, what did you just do? You armed yourself with the same mind that Christ had. You decided that you would give yourself in exchange for his suffering. Maybe you have more seniority. Maybe you have a higher place in status there, but you can take on his suffering for him, and you might just very well win that person to Christ. I don't know. But he says, and there could be much more serious circumstances than that. But he said, arm yourself with the same mind, for he that hath suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lusts of men, but to the will of God. So if you've stopped living to the lusts of men, If you've stopped living for prosperity, for personal enjoyment and peace, for personal satisfaction, you're no longer living with I as number one. You're no longer living about the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, and the lust of the flesh. You're no longer just trying to enjoy life, have a good time, maybe, live life for pleasure and ease and comfort. You're living your life for the glory of God. Then you're living according to the will of God. You're willing to suffer. You're willing to go through difficulty for Christ. You're living according to the will of God. And then there's another one in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 19. So a little bit further along, he says this, "Wherefore, let them that suffer according to the will of God." Some people suffer according to God's will. Yes, it is God's will that some of you suffer. That's not very exciting to hear. It is God's will that some of you suffer. Some of the deepest sufferings that I've had have not been very deep. But the times when life felt really dark, when it felt like I was suffering, those were the times when I found who I was. I searched my soul and I found how ugly I could be. And ugliness was rooted out, and it was replaced with joy and gratitude that God loved even me. And I could be grateful for Christ's work once again. Sometimes when life is going smooth and everything's going well, you don't really realize how awful you really are. You don't sense that you have fallen really short. And then difficulties come and you realize, man, oh man, I am nothing. I am useless. I am nobody. And then you can look to Christ again and recognize, in your eyes, God, I am fully accepted. I am completely loved. I am redeemed. I am righteous. I am holy. I am free from sin. And you can rejoice again, because during suffering, we see ourselves and we also can rejoice in what God has done. So if it is the will of God that you suffer, commit the keeping of your souls to Him in well-doing as unto a faithful Creator. So there's the idea is that when you're suffering, it's not like it's always the devil making you suffer. It's not like it's always people against you. It's God allowing you to be refined. There's a lot in that passage that we're not getting into today, but a lot about gold being purified and so on, about it taking fire to burn away the dross so that you can be presented holy and pure and godly. But if you suffer as a Christian, take it patiently, because it is the will of God that you do that. And He's going to allow circumstances to come into your life that will test you. Will you take it patiently? Will you suffer joyfully? Will you give thanks in it? If so be you suffer joyfully, you are doing the will of God. You're being like Jesus. Jesus suffered wrongfully, and He took it patiently, and He did it for you and for me. And so we can lay down our lives for our wives, first of all, men, as we're commanded to do. We can do it for our children. Wives, you can do it for your husbands and your children. We can do it for our employers. We can do it for our employees. We can lay down our lives for our co-workers and for people around us. We should do good to all men, but especially to the household of faith, Paul says in another spot. So there's a lot that we can do to accomplish the will of God. And it doesn't take a super spiritual person to figure out how to do the will of God. It is simple. Abstain from fornication. Walk in holiness, live in sanctification, understand what God has done for you, be thankful in everything, always, even in the midst of suffering and in deep, dark difficulties, rejoice that God has redeemed you, and you will be doing the will of God. And so much more. We can serve our employers, we can serve the government, we can serve our country, we can serve our fellow citizens, all to the glory of God. And whatsoever ye do, in word or in deed, do all to the glory of God. The last thing I would say is this. If I was an ambassador for Canada in, I don't know, China, Mexico, wherever you want to put me, and I'm a representative, when I go there, all they see of me is Canada. I am a representation of Canada. And so now we are called ambassadors for Christ. Wherever you go, whatever you do in word or in deed, the things you eat, the things you wear, the places you go, the entertainment you're part of, the games you play, the work you do, everything is representing heaven, representing Christ. You are ambassadors for Christ. And in the midst of that, we plead with people to come to salvation. So we stand in the gap between heaven and hell, and we allow people to see the goodness of God in us. We live the will of God, and then we present the will of God. Christ crucified is the will of God, and he did it for everyone. He's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And this is something every single one of us can do, preacher or not. We can live the will of God, we can rejoice in the will of God, and we can present the will of God to the people around us. Shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Put on the whole armor of God. Go out into the world with purpose, with vision, with passion, and serve the people in your circle. People that I could never reach, people that I could never touch. Serve them with the gospel. Serve them with a kind heart. Serve them with not eye service as men pleasers, but doing everything to the glory of God. This is the will of God. Walk in holiness. Love your wife. Love your children. Raise them up well. This is doing the will of God. And then maybe, just maybe, God might call you to a very specific purpose. And on that, I will not say much. I don't know exactly how that always comes about. In many cases, it's divine intervention. It's providence. God puts something before you, you choose it, and suddenly you realize in hindsight that God directed you in a certain path. Other times you need to make a decision and you pray about it and God gives you a sign or some answer. I don't know how that all works. It's different in so many different circumstances. But we do know what the will of God is for your life, and how to fulfill it, and how to walk according to it. Now, I know this, again, does not answer all the questions. I realize that there could be many more, and hopefully you'll put them in the comments. Maybe you'll ask some questions. Maybe there'll be some dialogue. Maybe you guys can answer questions that I have as well. But I really do appreciate you tuning in, and hopefully you're all walking in light of the gospel, living the truth and loving the Lord through it all. God bless you.